I've been preaching for a long time on this channel that you really need to immerse yourself in television if you want to learn a language like Chinese. Reading books alone just doesn't cut it. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be perfectly fine limiting your language study to just watching TV. Actually, what you really need to do is you have to combine exposure to native speech with actually reading the language. The best way to learn how to read Chinese characters is to learn how to write them. This is also true even if you're studying the kanji in Japanese, or if you're crazy enough to study hanja in Korean, or even the chunom in Vietnamese. I've spent more than 20 years now learning Chinese. My reading comprehension level isn't perfect, but it's good enough to read difficult older texts like Hong Lo Meng. And although I'm certainly not an expert, I can give you some advice to help you figure out the right way to approach learning Chinese characters. So I'm going to give you 5 basic tips here that will help your approach in learning Chinese characters. Now, these are going to count and help for you even if you're learning the kanji or if you're learning Chinese characters associated with other languages or dialects. I'll try to keep these general, simple, easy to follow, and it should help you regardless of the level that your language ability currently is at, right? Remember, like, I can't help this group over here that's advanced learners, this group that's intermediate, this group that's basic through the same video. So we'll do the best we can here. And I'll just start at the beginning, and you probably already know this tip by now. Tip number 1 is to practice writing.
专属
This is probably the most controversial tip of all, since nobody wants to actually practice writing.
就老爷上任还不到半年。
The thing is, though, that there's a reason why books like Integrated Chinese come with writing practice workbooks. And in my experience, if you want to really learn how to read, the easiest way is to learn how to write. So the reason why this works is because writing will help you internalize the characters. Now, I know people have complained before and said, well, you haven't quoted any academic studies or whatever. Go somewhere else to get that, right? I'm telling you this because I've experienced it myself, and I've seen tons and tons of anecdotes of people who don't do that. I have met hundreds of students of Chinese over the years, not Chinese students, but people learning the Chinese language, who have assured me that they can learn the characters just by like looking at them or whatever. Now, the truth is that the difference between different characters can be very, very subtle. The only way to really get to know that difference is by writing the characters yourself and getting a feel for them to the point where they are internalized. I'll give you a couple of really classic examples of this. This character is Mu, which means the eye, and that seems simple enough, right? However, when you compare it side by side with Zi, you'll see that the two characters are very similar. The difference is a single small line on the top of Zi. And then there's Qie, which looks similar to those two. Here, the difference is that the final stroke on the bottom is longer than it is in the other two characters. Now, if you're at the high beginner level, you probably are not going to confuse those characters. I mean, these are pretty common characters. But when you're starting out, this sort of thing can be really, really bewildering. The best way to learn and internalize the difference between these characters is simply to practice writing them and to drill yourself on them. And I've got a system that I think works fairly well. When I do my language study in Anki, I include cards that force me to practice writing in Chinese.
百依百顺
I've developed a pretty simple system for creating writing prompt cards out of existing notes, and it actually works pretty well. Now, for paper to practice writing on, I print out dozens of copies of this generic Chinese blank writing sheet, which comes from a writing practice notebook that was intended for little kids. Now, I've been personally following this system consistently for 20 years now. It's worked pretty well. It's helped me get to the point where even the difficult characters are pretty easy to internalize as long as I practice writing them. And by the way, if you get really bored, you can also find unusual words and characters to sort of keep things interesting. For example, you can learn words that are specific to dialects, like the negating adverb in Cantonese. This character really isn't used in standard Putonghua, but it is extremely common in Cantonese. Or in Taiwanese Hokkien, you get adjectives like sui, which means pretty, and which is a character that is basically obsolete in Guoyu. And then there are a bunch of different ways that yin, the third-person plural pronoun, is written in Taiwanese Hokkien. Or if you do a bunch of reading, you'll come across words like this one, Zhuanguan. These are two relatively common and easy to understand characters that have a pretty special meaning when you combine them together. And when it comes to learning new words, at least in my experience, there's no better way to do that than to practice writing. Sure, it takes time, but if you set this up as part of like a larger Anki deck, you can prevent yourself from becoming totally overwhelmed with a whole ton of characters at once. You want to try to learn things gradually instead of trying to cram everything in. And the reason for that has a lot to do with my second tip. Anyway, tip number 2 is to focus on learning words in context and not totally at random. Now, when you start learning Chinese, you likely will be tempted to get a book like this Reading and Writing Chinese List of Characters, which is supposed to help you pass the HSK exam. Now, at first glance, this probably seems helpful. After all, you can even find somewhat common words like ge-bi in the margins. But the thing is that word ge-bi is actually the Chinese word for the Gobi Desert in particular. Yeah, it does also mean desert in general, but that's a much rarer usage. It's kind of helpful to know that, but the truth is that the word shamo is a lot more common. And chances are that if you're like actually reading books in Chinese or articles, you will learn the word shamo before you learn the word ge-bi, unless you're reading whatever, like, I don't know, a book about, I like, an atlas or something like that, right? A book about Chinese geography. Anyway, that's my tip. Get rid of this, like, learn all the characters quick scheme that so many people push out there, and just start reading stuff, especially stuff you're interested in. Now, I've known people over time who have decided to read books written for children like this one to try to make things easier at the start. It kind of works, though I personally think you're much better off finding something that you're actually interested in instead of just limiting yourself to a bunch of kids' books. So back when I lived in China, I used to buy up tons of copies of this magazine called Dujia, or Readers. Believe it or not, this is actually a really good place to find short essays, excerpts from literary classics, and other articles that are actually interesting to adults trying to learn the language. While you occasionally do get propaganda, such as in this article about Zhou Enlai, it tends to be more light-handed than some of the other stuff that's out there, and it's still a lot more interesting than a textbook. Regardless of what you read, though, I very, very strongly recommend that you read at least something and make sure it's something you want to read. Do not expect that your textbook will give you everything you need, because it won't. Do not expect that you're going to like magically learn a bunch of the language by like poking around at random at Wikipedia articles. And above all else, stop using freaking ChatGPT. It's not going to give you the sentences and the stuff that you really want to get. It's going to give you a bunch of slop. Find books about topics you're interested in and piece your way through them, even though it's going to be slow at the beginning. It does take time at the start, sure, but you will start catching on to some little truths about how the language really works. For example, when you read these texts at first, you'll almost certainly have trouble figuring out where one word begins and where another word ends. Okay, so here's an example from my Honglou Meng translation just the other day. Alright, so this passage here says, Feng Jie ye jia yi yin qin, Rang zuo rang cha, or Wang Shifeng feigned an attitude of warm hospitality towards him and offered him a seat and some tea. Now, jia yi here is an adverb. These two characters go together and it means like falsely or fraudulently. Yin qin is a verb that means to treat somebody hospitably. You can find that one in your dictionary. But the thing is that not all of these words or semantic components, if you want to be technical about it, are two characters. So for example, the word rang that is duplicated here at the end is a one-word verb. It's to let somebody do something. So she lets him zuo. That's a verb that means to sit. And she also lets him have tea or cha. So maybe it's a noun that means tea, or maybe it's a verb that means to drink tea. It doesn't really matter. But if you were to go to your dictionary to look up something like rang cha, you would find nothing. And trust me, when you're first learning the language, you will get caught up in this trap all the time, because I've been there. In Chinese, it's very hard to tell what is a grammatical component of the language and what is a word, and which characters belong together, and so on, until you've built up a good vocabulary in your head. The problem is that building up that strong vocabulary means that you have to interact a lot with the language. You can't just memorize a whole bunch of characters out of context in a list and expect that to work. Now, the interesting thing is that this is easier in other languages that use Chinese characters than in Chinese itself. For example, if you look at this random paragraph from a Japanese video game magazine from 1986, you will notice that there is a mixture of kanji, hiragana, and katakana. It actually makes it somewhat easy to see which kanji belong together as a semantic compound, such as konshu, this week. The mo that comes after it is almost certainly a grammatical particle, especially since it's followed by katakana. And now you will understand the thing that people who've been studying Japanese for years keep telling you, right? This is that kanji makes Japanese easier to learn, not harder. In fact, I'll give you a real world example, right? So about a decade ago, I got really into Kondo Mori. Now I know if you look behind me here, I guess I have to go this way. You can tell that I'm not doing a very good job with all of that, right? But I have slowly started to reread her book again in the original Japanese. So if you're struggling to read her first chapter in Japanese, it's actually not hard to figure out where one word begins and where another word ends. For instance, the word resun, or lesson, here in the first paragraph stands out, once again because it is in katakana and it is surrounded by words in hiragana. Now, in this Chinese translation, the word is translated a little bit awkwardly. It's kaika jiaorun. The thing is, though, that you might have a hard time figuring out where these words start or stop since it's nothing but a string of Chinese characters. Now, back in the good old days, I would lug around a heavy dictionary like this one when I wanted to do some Chinese reading. And so I would wind up flipping around trying to find something in that mess of characters that looks like an actual word. For instance, I might come across this kai ka to teach a subject or a course. It's a lot easier these days since you can look things up digitally and you can get directly to a resource like Wiktionary if your book is in the right format. And there are apps and other things you can use that will help you figure out what is a semantic component, like a word, and what is not. And it really is helpful, and it goes a little bit faster if you use them. The real key here, though, is that you need to actually take the time to figure out what's going on in the context of what you're learning. You can't just memorize every possible form and meaning of a specific word, and expect that to stick. And of course, you really need to understand it before you can actually learn it. That's my third tip. Learn things that you understand and don't just go through lists of common characters. Now, this Super Memo article is over 25 years old now, but it's just as relevant today as it ever was. Remember that the first commandment is that you need to understand what you're learning first, and even though it might take a while, that means looking carefully at the text and being sure that you know where words begin and words end. And before you can memorize a word or character or whatever, you really need to take a few minutes to actually learn it. That cramming method does not work. Oh, and by the way, most beginners in Chinese or Japanese or whatever will start asking you questions about how many characters you know. I get this all the time. I've even seen people in the comments, apologies to you guys, but who say, well, I know about 500, I know about 700 or whatever. Look, if you're focusing on learning words, those semantic compounds that go together, sometimes 2, sometimes 4, sometimes 8, sometimes 5, you will not know what to answer here because you're like, well, I don't know. I know what this phrase means. I know what that phrase means, right? I haven't counted the characters, right? The thing is that you're learning the characters to understand words and to communicate in the language. You're not trying to get some sort of arbitrary high score. This isn't a video game. Years ago, I thought going through something like remembering the kanji would help me with my beginning approach to Japanese. With all due respect to the author and to those of you who love this book, I personally found it completely useless, especially since there were no pronunciations or examples of actual words. And this is probably going to get some of you really upset with me, but the truth is that this book represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of Chinese characters. So the thing is, Chinese characters are not hieroglyphics. There are some characters that have some meaning inherent in them because of how they're shaped, yes. But by and large, the vast majority of characters do not have that meaning that come from, the ideogram or whatever it is. Most of these characters were created and used to represent sounds going back thousands of years. The characters have been very closely tied together with the spoken language for a long, long time. And as a result, you really cannot learn the characters without learning the spoken language as well. I discovered an excellent website the other day on what we call paleography, or in particular the study of the etymology of Chinese characters. There's this fascinating and interesting article here about exposing the false etymology of Chinese characters. Among other things, the author explains that most Chinese characters are actually phonograms, or in other words, they're written the way that they're written because of their pronunciation. Or to put it bluntly, as Professor John DeFrancis did decades ago, Chinese characters are phonetic, not ideographic. And of course, anybody studying Japanese should know this right away. The problem with remembering the kanji is that it is completely divorced from the Japanese language itself. In fact, I would argue that this is an awful way to learn Japanese since you're trying to learn the characters as art instead of learning them as actual words. And Japanese happens to have multiple pronunciation systems for the same kanji, which means that learning the words in context is even more important in Japanese than it is in Chinese. So here, this is the Chinese character for heart. In Putonghua, you would read this as Xin, and it keeps its pronunciation in all the compound words that it shows up in, such as Shoukou Jinshin. Now in Japanese, its kunyomi is kokoro. So this kunyomi is the Japanese pronunciation of the word. You can think of this as the native Japanese pronunciation as opposed to a pronunciation that is derived directly from Chinese. I know that this is confusing at first, but if you learn the language, if you start getting into it, you'll start seeing it. In fact, you have to understand this to be able to really learn the language. If you don't get it, you're going to be completely bewildered, right? And it's really not that bad once you get the hang of it. Anyway, when you see the character by itself, it generally is going to be read as kokoro. For example, in the phrase kokoro no soko kara, from the bottom of one's heart, the character is read as kokoro. But it also has an onyomi, or Chinese-derived pronunciation of shin, which sounds familiar, right? And so if you're talking about the heart as an internal organ, it's pronounced shinzuo using the onyomi, not the kunyomi. Or if you're looking at the abstract term the center, like the center of town, it's called chushin. It uses the onyomi here as well. Of course, if you happen to speak Chinese already, you will likely be familiar with the extremely common term zhongshin, and you'll probably be happy that it is the same in Japanese as it is in Chinese. But do you see here what I'm talking about? So yeah, you can look at the ideograph and you'll know that it means heart, but it's imperative for you to know how to say the word. If you can't say the word, you can't pick it out of your favorite anime when you're sitting on the couch and watching it and it comes up. You won't understand what's going on when you're reading your favorite manga and you're trying to piece through it. And in many instances, you're going to run into words and phrases that are so abstract or idiomatic, usually because they're derived directly from Chinese, that you'll just want to give up, right? You have to learn these things as actual semantic entities, as actual words and sometimes phrases, instead of just learning them as pretty pictures. Now this brings me directly to my fourth tip. Okay, tip number 4 is to simplify your learning. If you're a beginning student of Chinese, this character will likely strike fear in your heart. In some instances, it is pronounced Xing. In other instances, it's pronounced Hang. And the truth is that you can only tell the difference from the context. The last thing in the world you want to do is to try to learn both the pronunciations of this character at the same time. Now, if you're smart and you're using Anki or a similar program, you will split this up into different notes. I very strongly recommend learning this character in the context of other characters, as in you're reading a book and you come across this and you're like, oh, well, this is with this character, this makes this word, I'm going to learn this word. Because you will see the pronunciation split more clearly and it will make more sense to you in those semantic compounds or in those words, right, with 2 characters or more. In colloquial Chinese, Xing by itself means okay or that's all right, and that's really the only time you'll see this character in isolation. Now, sometimes it means travel, such as in Xingcheng, which means your trip. Sometimes it means to act, such as in Xingshi, which means to act or do something if it's a verb, or behavior in general if it's a noun. These are 2 meanings that are basically the same thing when you really think about it. But sometimes it means a row or rank of things, like in Hanglie, and this is without other pronunciations. And sometimes it means bank, such as in Yinghang. So what do you do here with so many options? Well, you don't try to learn them all at once because you will go crazy. Learn the words instead. Learn those 2 character compounds instead. See, this is the reason, again, why you need to learn from reading text instead of just looking at lists of words someone just made up and put out of context. When you read the text yourself, you likely won't see that the character will be all by itself in a situation where it's pronounced something like Hang, right? That only happens if you're reading classical Chinese and certain texts. So in other words, the real secret to learning the Chinese language, learning the characters, or learning Japanese, or whatever it is you're learning that involves Chinese characters, is to learn them in their natural habitat, not in a bunch of long word lists and not in a bunch of scammy books that promise to help you learn it in an incredibly short period of time, because that doesn't work. So this guy named Danny Crichton published this blog entry about a decade ago about trying to use Anki to learn Korean and how it didn't work. Now, as is common with tech bros, Crichton starts this off with a bunch of meaningless stats instead of talking about what approach he took. Now, Crichton's problem is that he decided to stick a bunch of Korean words onto a single card for some stupid reason, and I honestly don't know what word this card is supposed to be. Crichton eventually came to his senses and tried again, this time using cards that had fewer bits of information on them. But even still, he couldn't avoid the temptation of sticking a ton of synonyms on a card at once, which leads, of course, to a lot of confusion. All right, so don't do that. Don't follow that guy. I think he's an idiot, but whatever. You guys can go tell him, whatever. Just keep it simple. Learn the language as it is. Don't try to make it more complex than it needs to be. If you're going through your studies using Anki or whatever, and you're finding yourself taking an incredibly long time on a very complex card, delete the card. Make it simpler, right? You don't want to have a bunch of stuff that wastes your time. Trust me, do not waste your time with this like all-in-one approach. This is also the reason why you don't want to download those downloadable decks for Chinese, Japanese, and so on, because the majority of people who make those decks do not understand this basic principle. Do not waste your time with them. This is that minimum information principle. If you actually want to remember what you learn, you need to take complex things and make them simple. So instead of learning every possible pronunciation of this character at once, split it up and only learn the words that are actually meaningful to you. Now, my fifth tip is also going to be kind of controversial. We're going to keep it short here, but I honestly think this is really helpful. The fifth is that you really need to get out of your comfort zone. Like, you should absolutely start out reading things that you're interested in, but you don't know much about, right? Or you don't know the words in that language. But after a while, you want to expand to other things that are interesting that you might have no clue about, right? That's the best way to give yourself a broad vocabulary and to find new words and characters to practice and learn. I mean, by all means, read all about cleaning your house and your life if that's really what motivates you. But you should also give yourself some time to read something fun and cute once in a while. And that kind of variety is the reason I've always loved those literary anthologies. The variety of articles will help you develop a huge vocabulary. So overall, you're going to have a much better time with this language. If it's Chinese, if it's Japanese, if you're going crazy with Hanja and Korean or whatever, you're going to have a much better time with this language if you spend as much time as you can doing things you enjoy doing with the language. Do not limit yourself to your textbook. Please do not do that. Do not buy those long lists of words or those books about like the 3,000 top Chinese whatever or anything like that. Don't fall into those study traps. And if there's something that's AI generated, you should throw that away right away because that's not going to help you, right? Learn the language on its own terms. Learn it for what it is, and you will find that you will have a much better time with it and that you're going to learn a lot more of the language, and it's going to be a lot easier for you as well. You see, the key to fluency in Chinese is not to learn the 3,000 characters or 5,000 characters or whatever that they tell you means that you're fluent. Now, the key is to develop a large vocabulary. You need to practice writing characters, you need to internalize them, and you need to use the language frequently. That's the key to being fluent in it, not just to memorize a long list of characters. And it will be a lot more fun for you if you make the language a living thing than if you try to memorize everything as a bunch of pretty pictures.